take a look at both of these pictures. Is that the same butterfly? If you look close, well, they look similar, but there's some slight differences if you look at the butterflies. What are these? Well, this actually happens to be what we call the viceroy butterfly, and this one is the famous monarch butterfly. Why do they look the same? Well, believe it or not, this one evolved or was selected by nature to look like that one. Why did that happen? Why would one butterfly change over time to look like another one? In this video, we'll talk about natural selection mechanisms and how this occurred to these butterflies. Let's get started. So, selection, in other words, natural selection, how nature selects things to evolve, can take several forms. So one that we talk about is artificial selection. So if you look at the word artificial, right, that sounds like it's not a real selection, sort of, right? It's artificial. That's actually when humans are involved. So we'll talk about artificial selection first. Later in the video, we'll move to natural selection. And natural selection can take a few forms as well. So if you think about nature selecting what traits evolve to the next generation, we've got a few sort of ways that can happen. One is sexual selection, right? Mates choosing certain traits. Another is physiological, in terms of the body, the organism itself, its physiology, what is best for it. And then another one, of course, how does nature select? It's all about predation selection. Some traits allow animals, organisms, living things to be better predators or, in fact, to escape predators, either way. So in this video, we're going to look at all of these selection mechanisms that will help us understand a bit more how natural selection occurred and how things evolve and adapt over time. So we start with the first one, artificial selection. And as I mentioned, this is really, it's not really nature selecting, but humans have kind of intervened, right? And so if you think about how this happens over time, let me give you a few examples. If you think about some of the food we eat, right? Cabbage, kale, well, I don't eat these foods, maybe you do. Broccoli, cauliflower. These are actually all from the same family, the wild mustard plant, Brassica. And so what happened over time was that when this particular plant would grow certain flower buds or stems that were pretty big, humans, right, farmers would select those and mate those again. So over time, the flowers and buds would get bigger. That was broccoli. If the leaves were a certain type that were edible and actually started to be a little more colorful here that you can see like in kale, those were selected over time. Well, if you look at the buds, right, that's cauliflower. If you think of flower, right, the flower buds. So basically what happened over time is humans intervened. We took certain plants that naturally had different characteristics, and then we crossbred or hybridized those over time. We selected them artificially to grow into all of these foods that maybe you enjoy to eat, but they're all actually descendants from this one plant. Also think about all the different breeds of dogs, right? You can have a big dog like we see here, and that dog can actually mate with one of these tiny dogs here and give us some sort of hybrid, right? We often call these mutts, often some of the best dogs in my opinion. But what you see here is that humans have intervened in the selection, and so we could over time, if we wanted to make a really small dog, right, we'd take the runts of all the litters and then breed those, and then we take the runts of the next litter and breed those, and over time you could see how we could get different types or different breeds of dog because we intervened. This is all called artificial selection because it's us humans intervening. So now I want to talk about and move on to nature selecting or natural selecting and the forms that takes. One of the most obvious forms is predation selection. That, of course, means Nature selects traits that help some organisms become better predators or other organisms to escape from those predators. And a common example, of course, is camouflage. So if we look here at this particular picture, you look at that and you're like, okay, there's some twigs there and some leaves. Would you believe that there's actually an animal there, a dead leaf mantis? Right there, you can sort of see the legs. That's a dead leaf mantis. It looks like a dead leaf, right? It was named appropriately. And that particular organism evolved camouflage so that it can escape predators, right? If you're a bird or you're some other predator looking through this and you're like, just a bunch of leaves, I'm going to move on, that has helped that mantis survive, and those genes get passed on to the next generation. So here we see some more camouflage. Can you tell what those are? Yeah, those are actually fish. Those are particular flounders. We're called stone flounders. And what you see here is that this fish really blends in well with the stone underneath it. So if there's a predator fish coming along, it's likely going to move past it and not see it. So that helps it survive. Those that survive pass those genes on to the next generation. Can you tell what that is? That's a fascinating bird called the tawny frogmouth. And if you look, notice that the pattern of the tree really matches the pattern of the tawny frogmouth. Really, really interesting. So you might not even notice that that's there. This image, or these images here, take us right back to the beginning, right? This is the viceroy butterfly, and this is the monarch. And these butterflies exhibit something we call mimicry, right? If something mimics something else. Well, why has the viceroy butterfly evolved to mimic the monarch butterfly? Well, we actually know that the monarch butterfly is pretty toxic to a lot of animals, right? It makes them sick. So over generations, many predators, many animals have avoided eating the monarchs because it makes them sick. Well, if you evolve then and have some traits that look like the monarch butterfly, predators are probably going to avoid you too. So we call this mimicry because at one point some of these viceroy butterflies had adaptations or traits which made it look a little more like the monarch. Well, then those survived, those reproduced, passed those genes on to the next generation. So over time, the viceroy really starts to resemble the monarch butterfly. And then, of course, you think about other ways you escape a predator would be speed. Or if you are a predator, like the cheetah we see here, you could pretty much catch anything, right? So speed is another predation selection. Over time, the cheetahs that were faster, those genes got passed on to the next generation. Behaviors and habits, these can help with predation. And the last one I want to talk about is defense. And, you know, I've used a lot of animals, but plants also are selected by nature as well. You may not think of that, but if you think of a particular plant that has thorns, right? That's actually a physical defense. If I'm outside and I see something with a lot of thorns, I'm pretty much going to avoid it. And a lot of other animals do as well. So that's a protective mechanism from predators. Okay, so all of these are about predators. So one of the forms of natural selection is predation selection. So another form of natural selection is physiological, right? If you think of like anatomy and physiology, this is just how the organism's body works, right? All the inner workings, the things that allow the particular organism to live and survive. Well, one of those, of course, would be fitness. An organism that is fit, in other words, can gather food, for example, is more able to survive. So if you think about the giraffe, right, there's a few things that the giraffe has evolved to be able to gather food more easily. One, you know, of course, is that really long neck, right? They can reach higher. That is a fitness or physiological selection mechanism. And then you think also there's these really long tongues. If you've ever fed giraffes, I got to do that at a zoo once, those tongues are really long. They're standing a long way from you, and if you ever get to feed one, that tongue just comes out all of a sudden. It's really long. It might startle you. But that is a fitness or physiological mechanism to survive, to get food. This is one of my favorite pictures These are the climbing tree goats of Morocco. And they have actually evolved to be able to climb to get the argan fruits in these argan trees in Morocco. And they just kind of get up there and, get the fruits, but they also can look out and look for predators, right? So those are some fascinating animals, the climbing tree goats of Morocco. Then another physiological selective mechanism would be the efficiency of your physiology, right? How well do you process oxygen or process food, drink water, take in water, process water? That is a really interesting way to study organism evolution. And then disease resistance, if you think about, that could actually also help an organism survive physiologically. And here is an interesting example of that. This particular gene, the CCR5 delta gene, in some human beings, there's a mutation. And this mutation actually allows for HIV resistance, right? So believe it or not, there are some humans born on our planet with a gene that makes them resistant to HIV, of course, which later turns into AIDS. So this is evolution in action. We can see humans still evolving because some are resistant to some diseases. And that obviously helps people survive, pass those genes on to the next generation. Protection from injury, biochemical versatility, these are other examples of physiological selection. I want to talk about this last one, right? Our biological chemical versatility, how having different chemicals in our biology can help us. And the example I want to give you is that some fish have adapted to very cold environments by evolving antifreeze proteins, right? So if you think about fish that live in really cold climates or really cold water, how do they survive? Well, actually, some of them have evolved these antifreeze proteins. Here's an example of one, right? It's got a hydrophobic face on one, a hydrophilic face on the other side. And these proteins actually are, what we've called them as antifreeze proteins. It helps them not to freeze or helps their internal fluids and their internal physiology adapt to that really cold environment. Okay? So all of these things help physiology, so natural selection or nature favors them or selects often many of these traits to move to the next generation. And then the last one we want to talk about here is sexual selection. So sexual selection is about how one mate is found attractive by another mate. And it can also include how fertile the gametes are. So if you look here at the picture of the lion, right, the alpha lion, believe it or not, there are certain traits on this lion that females find more attractive and will prefer to have sex with. In this case, the darkness of the mane of the lion is actually a sexual selective mechanism. Females prefer that, or lionesses prefer the dark mane. It's probably because that dark mane absorbs more heat. They're more likely to survive in the hot climate where we find lions. But the lionesses prefer these really dark manes in these alpha males. And then, of course, the peacock, right? What is all of this about? Like, that seems really extra, right, if you think about it. But over time, what has happened is the peahens prefer the peacocks with these elaborate displays, right? But if you think about it, there's really a trade-off here. Does this mean this peacock has good genes, right? Why would a peahen, a female, be attracted to this peacock that has all this elaborate display? Because if you think about it, there's got to be a trade-off here. Yeah, all of this is going to help attract a mate, but at the same time, all this crazy plumage or feathers is really going to attract predators too. So there's a natural trade-off that we find with some of these sexual selective mechanisms. Yeah, you're going to get the ladies with all this, but you might also get a predator to attract you. And so these are some examples of sexual selective mechanisms. Because if you really think about it, All those other things, natural selection, we're talking about predation selection and physiological selection, that doesn't really matter if you don't reproduce to the species, right? The species needs you to do two things. It needs you to survive, and it needs you to mate, pass those genes on to the next generation. So this is also one of my favorite organisms to talk about that you see here. This is the bird of paradise. And these are some crazy, fascinating looking birds. I mean, look at that thing, right? That is some crazy looking bird there. Why are all of these birds of paradise, right? If you look at all these differences here, why do they all look like that? What's going on with this elaborate display? Why are they so fascinating? Well, it's all about competition for mates. And a lot of these birds that you see that are super colorful are the male of the species. And they're trying to attract the female of the species. So if you look here, here's the male, all right? Look at all this crazy stuff it's doing to attract the female. So they undergo through these ritualistic displays, all these rituals displaying, all their feathers and trying to show to the female, hey, look at me. Come, let's mate, right? It's all about sexual selection. And over time, what we found is the females started to prefer and mate with the ones that had these elaborate displays. Another sort of famous example is the blue-footed boobies we find in the Galapagos. What's the deal with the blue feet? Well, actually, over time, the females started to prefer the males that had the blue feet. And they do these elaborate little dances, or they lift up the feet. And that's how females will choose a mate. So sexual selection drives evolution as well. It's not just about survival, it's also about mating. So a lot of the traits that we see or the things we do, you look at it and you say, why does an animal do that? Why do we do that? Why do we go to dances and shake and move? Well, a lot of that is rooted in sexual selection, right? These displays, these rituals for mating are really common in evolution and the survival of the species. So if you think about all the stuff that we've looked at in this video, we talked about all the different ways that nature or humans artificially select traits to move to the next generation. And that is what helps drive evolution.